So this is the middle week of our series entitled The Happiness Project, in which we're trying to talk about this subject that we all care about a great deal and wish we had more of. We're talking about it from the timeless wisdom of Scripture. What does the Bible have to say about happiness? And what can we learn from it? And maybe, just maybe, at the end of this, when we hit week 5 and we work together on our personal happiness plans, we'll find that we can be or will be a little more happy for having spent this time together. First, as we get started today, let me ask you this very basic, fundamental question. When people talk about who God is, what often makes the list? And I'm not saying you, I'm just saying even other people that you know. What's usually on the list of his attributes or his characteristics or his personality traits? We probably know it would be things like, well, he's gracious, he's merciful or compassionate, he's just. Some people might get abstract and talk about him being all-knowing or in every place at every time, that he's timeless and eternal and everlasting. Okay, well, that's all great. Here's what the great Christian thinker and writer G.K. Chesterton wrote at the start of the 20th century. He wrote about that list that somewhere on it should be happiness. The quote is, "God is the happiest being in the entire universe." Now, maybe you, like me, the first time I read that and encountered Chesterton's discussion of God being joyful, will realize you've never really ascribed that trait to God very often. Loving, yes. Just, yes. Happy? No. But God is. If joy is a virtue, then God has it most of all. And in fact, there are things that God has or experiences that are temporary. Like, God gets angry sometimes, but that's temporary. God is sorrowful. If it's true that God is the happiest being in the universe, it is also true that at this very moment and throughout human history, he is the most sorrowful, but that is temporary. Because someday he will set the world right, and all he will be is happy. It's going to be important when we come to the end of the message today and what Paul has to tell us about happiness. Just keep that in mind, that God is the happiest being in the universe. We want to return today to a look at a small letter written by St. Paul in your New Testament, which has to do with one of the biblical words that is the closest to what we in English call happiness, and that's the word joy. And it's the little letter of Philippians. And what's maybe most telling and revealing about this letter and its focus on joy is where Paul was when he wrote it and to whom he wrote it. Paul was under house arrest in Rome when he wrote this letter. His life hung in the balance. Some historians will tell you that weeks after writing this letter or months after writing this letter, he's going to be executed for his faith. At the very best, he got a reprieve, and about 3 years later or 5 years later, he was going to be executed for his faith. And there under house arrest, with his life in peril, he writes a letter full of joy. And he writes it to a group of people in the town of Philippi who were about to enter into a 5 to 10 year stretch where their lives were going to hang in the balance because of their faith. And many of them were going to suffer and be persecuted and, yes, even die for being Christians. And yet he writes to them this letter full of joy. Today, let's start here. Chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. And Paul says this to the Philippian Christians. "But even if I am being poured out like a sacrifice of perfumed oil over a temple altar, as an offering for your faith, I am glad, and, there's our word, rejoice with all of you. And in the same way, you also must be glad and rejoice with me. Here Paul is using an image that would have been common or understandable for the recipients of this letter 2,000 years ago. It was common practice in typical Greek or Roman towns for there to be a pagan temple, and in that temple is an altar, and you go to the altar and you make sacrifices, and the sacrifices weren't just animals. One of the kinds of sacrifices you would make is what you and I would call a kind of perfume, very expensive. It was perfumed oil. And there over the open flame you would pour the perfumed oil. And it was a very multi-sensory experience because you would smell the perfume in the air as all this oil was poured out. And here he says to the Philippians, look, I get it. I am here in Rome, and I may very well lose my life soon because of my faith, because of my work for Christ, because of you, the church I planted some years ago in northern Greece. And I'm good with that. Not only am I good with that, I'm glad, and I rejoice. And I invite you to rejoice with me that my life is being poured out like perfumed oil over an open flame, and it smells marvelous. Earlier, one chapter earlier, he talks about the same dynamic in these more famous verses in Philippians. He writes, yes, and I will continue to, there's our word, rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this, my house arrest, will turn out for my deliverance. There's his hope of not dying soon. It is my eager expectation and hope that Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by my life or by my death. For to me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. I am hard-pressed between these two outcomes, living for Christ and dying for gain. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain here on earth is more necessary for you because of my work with you and my ministry among you and what I am doing for Christ and his kingdom. Paul, in these two passages, especially that last one, is talking about two different frames of reference in regard to time and joy. There is joy now, and there is joy later. And he describes both in very different ways. And what we want to do this morning is talk about how he describes joy now in the present tense, and then how he describes joy later in the future to come. When, he doesn't know, but he knows it's coming. Joy now and joy later. Here's the first thing that we can say with pretty strong clarity about joy now for St. Paul as he writes to the Philippians in those verses that I read for you this morning. Joy now requires a cause greater than yourself. It requires something bigger than yourself. In order for you to be happy today, you have to be living for something that is bigger than you. Now, admit with me, perhaps, at least on your worst days, if you and I had been in Paul's place, I don't know that I would have responded his way. If there I am after some 30 years, 25 years of ministry for Jesus, there I sit under house arrest and my life hangs in the balance, I don't know that my emotional response to that would be joy. I think there's a decent chance that sometimes my emotional response to that would be despair. Really? It has come to this, that I'm going to die here without friends, beheaded by Roman authorities. Really? How about regret? Would any of you feel that? I might. How could I maybe have done this ministry thing in a more subtle way, flown under the radar a little bit, so that I didn't end up here, about to be murdered or executed for my faith. What else might you have thought? How about doubt? If I'd only done things in the right way, or maybe at some point along the line I got out of line with God's will for me or what he wanted me to do, and that's why I'm here. I am here under house arrest, about to lose my life because somewhere God and I got out of step. These are not his reactions. His reaction was joy because he said, "You're worth my life." To those Philippian people, right? He said, "My life is like that expensive perfumed oil, and I'm being poured out over an open flame. And your good and your spiritual growth and what Christ can do in your life, it's worth my life, and it makes me happy." It is something bigger than him. It is something outside of him. It is something that lives far beyond the borders of his own mind and his own body. It is not about him. It's about them. And he said, "You're big enough that it's worth my life." For him, the greater things in his life were the people that he served and he ministered to. It was the mission of Christ to extend the teaching and the name and the resurrection of Jesus to all who would hear. It was planting churches all over the known eastern part of the Roman Empire. And yes, it was Jesus himself. All of these things were bigger than him, and they were worth his life. And it made him happy to give his life to something that was worth it. What's the big thing in your life that you are trying to serve? Where in the world are you trying to make a dent? For whom? And the answer can't be you. It has to be something bigger or better. Where are your things like Paul? It can be very specific. It can be that at this moment, there is somebody that God has brought into your life and you are trying to care for them or serve them or reach out to them or sacrifice for them, and right now they are the greater good that's bigger than you that is worth your life. Great. What is it for you? And it is not enough for it to be you or your biological family. What is it for you? This is a key to happiness. Here's why. What you see in these words from the Apostle Paul is something that has been said about happiness for literally thousands of years by all kinds of human beings. Not just Christian human beings or in the Old Testament Jewish human beings, all kinds of human beings. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, who is probably in the last 50 years the greatest expert on the subject of psychological happiness and suffering, says this. The Buddha says this. All kinds of people say what's up on the screen, and here's the insight they tell you. You can't pursue happiness directly. You get it as the side effect of something else. Which means that great American phrase that we think somehow is an inalienable right for all of us, the pursuit of happiness, is actually a dead end. You will not be happy by trying to pursue being happy. Every hedonistic American who thinks they can buy enough or make enough or look young enough or be attractive enough needs to get that through their head and their heart. You will not be happy by trying to pursue happiness itself. Not going to happen. If your life is a car trip and you get into the driver's seat of your car in your driveway, what you do not program into the Verizon navigation app for where you want to go is happiness. You need to program something else in. But you know what you get along the way? Happiness. What you need to program into your navigation app is that greater good, that greater cause, the something that is bigger than you, that is worth your life. That is the destination of where you need to be going. And if you do that, then just like Paul, guess what? Along the way, you're going to gain happiness too. That's how it works. You will not be happy if that is the thing that you are trying to get out of your life. You ever seen that true for you? You ever seen that true of other people around you? Where they seem content or serene, or they seem like they are unflappable and unmovable. And the reason that's true is not that they're extroverted or gregarious or excitable. It's because they're devoting their life, they're investing their life in something about which they are passionate and they care about, and they can see it makes a difference. And oh, by the way, guess what they get as a nifty little byproduct? Happiness. That can be your life too. This is what you see in St. Paul. And that is also why true happiness, biblical happiness, is compatible with pain. It is compatible with suffering. Because the big causes, the worthwhile causes of your life, the worthwhile people in your life, sometimes those situations are hard and they cost you, but it will not make you unhappy. One eyewitness who went over and spent time with the late Mother Teresa in Calcutta as she worked among the deeply poor and the deeply sick and people who were dying on the streets in her arms, said about Mother Teresa, quote, "She glowed with joy." Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian pastor in Nazi Germany who tried to lead a coup or participate in a coup against Hitler. It failed. So he ended up, for the last year of his life, before being executed, in a prison camp. One of the English officers who was in the prison camp with Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, and I quote, "Everywhere that man went, he spread an atmosphere of joy and happiness." Because your life can be and should be about things that are bigger than you, more worthwhile than just your little life, you will find that you can get hurt and stay happy. You can suffer for the right things and stay happy. You can sacrifice for worthwhile things and stay happy, just like Paul. The great Christian thinker in the 20th century, a German theologian named Karl Barth, said it this way: from a Christian understanding, happiness is a defiant nevertheless in the world. A defiant nevertheless. This is what you hear in the words of Paul. I gave my life to Jesus, and I gave my life to you, Philippians, and I gave my life to his work in the world, and it was worth it. And I will not let my present circumstances with my life about to be extinguished take that from me. I will defiantly say, no, I rejoice because my life is being poured out for something bigger than me. And there he sat under house arrest, about to be executed, the happiest man on earth. I bet you wouldn't trade. I bet you wouldn't hesitate to trade your life for that, and neither would I. These are the keys to happiness now. But if you caught it, here in these famous verses in Philippians chapter 1, you also have Paul talking about the happiness or the joy to come. He says that, for example, right now in my life, for me to live is Christ, but dying is gain. No matter whether in my life or my death, I know that Christ is going to be exalted. And I am hard-pressed personally between the two outcomes, because I actually even desire to depart and be with Christ. What does that tell you? Not just about his experience of joy now that comes from this greater good or this greater cause that is worth his life, What's it tell you about his perspective on joy to come? Well, it's really this. Paul doesn't know any more about life after death than you do. I am reminiscent of my father has been an elder in his church for decades now and has always been one of my own greatest ministry mentors because of that fact. He told me one time about visiting a friend of his who was in his 50s dying of cancer in the hospital. And that friend, in a quiet moment just between the two of them, said to my dad, "You know, I'm scared. Even though I've been a Christian my whole life and I love Jesus and I trust God, I'm scared." My dad held his hand and said, "Of course you are. You've never done this before. And every time you do something the first time, it's scary. Don't beat yourself up about that." Paul's no different than you and me in that regard. You've never done the dying thing before, and neither have I. But here's what Paul knew. Paul knew that God made him happy now. Could be for the reasons we talked about last week, where Paul had traded in this normal, typical way that human beings do religion for something simpler, more focused on Jesus, that was full of faith, and he found it to be rich and fulfilling. Maybe that's the thing that made Paul happy now. Maybe it's some of the things we've talked about today. Maybe he found that living for Christ or being connected to Christ or living for other people or finding that God's work in the world was the greater thing beyond himself that was worth his life. Doesn't matter what it is. What he knew is that God made him happy now. And his one assurance that he had is the God who makes me happy now, will be the God who makes me happy forever. And so I am unafraid. One of the things I get to do in this line of work is I get to walk with people as they die. And it's not for everybody, I'll tell you that. But it has been one of the most insightful and enriching things that I've ever done. Because sometimes you get to hold somebody's hand as they know that they're succumbing to heart failure, to cancer, just to old age and being tired. And this person of faith will look you in the eye and they'll say, "Oh, I can't wait. The Jesus that I have trusted with my heart, I now will get to see with my eyes. The God who has made me happy all of my life will now greet me with an embrace after I die." And they have tapped into the same insight that Paul has here. This is why, by the way, Christian people, aside from the fact that all of us only die once, and so it's new to all of us, the other reason that Christian people are afraid is because they've spent their life not connected very well to the God who is our joy, and say they don't have that assurance that that God is going to be there on the other side to greet them and fill them with happiness too. Who wouldn't want their life to be just like Paul's? A God who made them happy and filled them with joy now, and therefore gave them the confidence that no matter what was to come, even after their dying day, that God was going to continue to make them happy and to fill them with joy. This is the great insight of St. Paul on happiness. It is eternal because God is eternal. Your happiness now that he gives you can be your happiness forever. And there he sat under lock and chain, unafraid of death, because his God of joy now would be his God of joy forever. Let me summarize what we talked about today and Paul's insight about joy now and later with these two quotes. First, about joy now. This is from a pretty well-known motivational speaker and speaker on leadership named Brian Tracy. See if this is not exactly what you saw in Paul about joy today. To be truly happy, you need to have a clear sense of direction. You need a commitment to something bigger and more important than yourself. You need to feel that your life stands for something, that you are somehow making a valuable contribution to your world. If you are not willing, according to St. Paul, to make that kind of wager and commitment, then you're likely not going to be able to be very happy on a consistent basis in your own life. And you surely can't make happiness the goal, because you'll never get there. And C.S. Lewis, the great Christian author from the 20th century, says about joy later this great, simple, insightful quote. Whatever you think heaven is about, he says, let me tell you what it's really going to be about. Joy is the serious business of heaven. Paul knew that. Paul knew the God of joy that filled him with happiness today, and he fully expected that after he died, he would experience more of the same. This is your hope and my hope too. Oftentimes when we talk about happiness, it is so short-term. It is so focused on now. And the great good news of the Christian faith is no, happiness is not just your aspiration for today, it is your destiny tomorrow. Because the serious business of heaven is joy. Would you pause for a minute here at the end of the message? And why don't you talk to God or give him space to talk to you about these insights about joy or happiness that we gleaned from Paul today. About joy today, but also joy later. Pause for a minute and pray, and then I'll pray for us all.